Evening, Ash.
Evening, mate. You all right?
Yes, yes. Have you noticed we've got someone else in the room?
She's up here for me.
Oh, yes. Is she there?
Yeah.
One of those. She's down there for me. So this is probably where she's going to be on the recording, to be honest.
Wherever you're looking for Violet, when you find the button, click the like and subscribe. Crap thing. Yes, please. Yeah.
Yes, we're a week late with this one. We did something in your absence, Violet. No worries, we covered. And we are back this time. So again, just likes, smash things and bells and stuff. And all that stuff that the kids talk about doing, which is brilliant, to try and get these things going. So drugs.
Yes.
God, I miss drugs. Anyway.
Oh God, drugs.
Yeah. Those lucky kids. Yeah. Sorry.
Violet is our guest today. She is, I'm going to call her an authority because she's read a lot more about old stuff than I have. She is an absolute authority on Victorian writing, Gothic writing. She has written books on Regency practices in various different forms, and recently published a book about the history of vampires through media, which is an incredibly good read. And is also loved by members of the cast of What We Do in the Shadows as well, which is an incredible thing, I think, to when you get someone from the genre you're talking about loving your work. So welcome, Violet, and would you please tell us all what we have been reading in your honour?
Yeah, thank you. Please. Hi. Right, you've put me on the spot here because you know damn well that I had to reread this in a panic this week because I couldn't remember anything about it. So thanks, Col. Castle of Otranto basically is accepted to be the first Gothic novel. So the first example of Gothic literature. Pretty much Horace Walpole kind of invented it and he lived it as well. For those who don't know, he built Strawberry Hill House, which is a sort of an example of Gothic architecture. The Priory Hospital was modelled after it and places like that. And he decorated that house with what he called gloomth. So he was your first Goth, 1786 or whatever it is. Do you know what? I can't actually remember the date this came out now.
We don't worry. We can hardly remember our names half the time, to be perfectly honest with you.
Yeah, it's hang on. I'm going to be
1764 for the book, wasn't it?
1764.
Was it? Let's just 1764 it was. Yeah, you're right. If you ever see a first edition, if you do, steal it for me, but if you do, it'll say 1765, but it wasn't. It was 1764. So it's basically written, let's get to the nitty-gritty of the book. It's written as a found documentation. So it was presented certainly to the public at the time when it was released that Walpole had written this based on documentation that he'd found retelling tales from the Crusades. So I can't remember the Crusades dates, about 1070 something to 12, something like that. Does that sound about right?
That sounds about right, yeah.
Yeah, and the idea was that this had been written up in the 1500s and that Walpole had rediscovered it and was rewriting it for a modern to him contemporary audience. It wasn't. It was entirely Walpole's imagination. And actually, there was a backlash on this. It was a massive seller. It was sort of 50-50 as people loved it or they hated it, but it sold really well. It went into a second edition literally a few months after the first one came out. But people went against it when they realised it wasn't real. They were gutted to realise it wasn't a true story. So that's how it's written. So it is what seem to us now as really familiar tropes. You've got your crumbling castle, your princess in peril, your terrible madman, a ghost rattling the attic. So the Castle of Otranto, Manfred and his family. Manfred is sort of the king part in this. He is the head of the Castle of Otranto. He is married to Hippolyta, and they have a son and a daughter, Conrad and Matilda. And I'm looking at the frowny, squinty face here because, as we both know, I've reread this. I read it at length years ago and then rapidly again this last couple of weeks. And being me, when I really should have reread it this afternoon, I went and got in the bath and read The House of Usher instead. So that's just me.
Yes.
So you've got the Castle of Otranto. You've got Manfred. He is your main protagonist. He's the Lord of all he surveys. He is as a stern sort of leader, and he is determined to keep Otranto in the family. There is a legend that Otranto will fall when the incumbent becomes too large for the castle. I think the wording is, I can't remember. There isn't really an explanation of this, and this is a bit of a hand of God thing, in that Walpole actually says in it there's no explanation. This doesn't make much sense. A lot of the time, he says it a few times through stuff that things don't really make sense. And so he's desperate to marry off his son Conrad, who to a Princess Isabella, because he needs heirs to keep Otranto in the family. Isabella is not keen on this marriage, but is pragmatic in the way of your medieval princesses, in that she knows she's got to. Conrad, who is, he's shown as being sickly and a bit lesser and whatever from the start, is dead within the first couple of pages, really. The one you think in a normal story would be your hero is dead. He's going to the wedding, and a giant helmet, Fenn, drops and lands on him and kills him, and goes into quite some detail about shattering him into lots of pieces. So the bridegroom is dead. Normally, most people would think, oh, whoa, mourning and everything. No, Manfred knows he's got to keep Otranto going. So what he'll do is marry Isabella. This is his daughter-in-law to be. So never mind the fact that he is already married. He decides he will divorce Hippolyta, his wife, because she is sterile. I think is the word they use, in order to marry Isabella, in order to keep Otranto going. So Isabella doesn't want any of this, fairly understandably. There's implied threat of rape. Isabella runs away. She gets out through the tunnel under the... No, does she get through the tunnel? I can't remember who gets through the tunnel.
Yes, she does. Yeah. She goes down to the tunnels.
Yeah, and goes out to the church of, I think, St. Nicholas, which is her, she goes to the priest, to the church, and she takes a refuge there. And obviously Manfred's going mad trying to find her. His daughter and wife are obviously devastated. Their son and brother have just died, and they can't understand why Manfred isn't grieving with them. He tells his daughter that he never wanted a daughter, she should get out. He tells his wife that he, makes it clear that he doesn't want his wife anywhere near him. It becomes, in some bits, it's almost a comedy of errors when there's two of the staff come up to tell him that more spooky shit is going on. Because of that, Isabella escapes. It sounds like I'm rambling here, but actually, as you know, there is no way of explaining Otranto in a sensible way. It doesn't work sensibly. So, mid-threat of rape, poor old Isabella, she gets saved by a ghost, because this shit happens in the medieval ages. Because one of the portraits comes down off the wall, distracts Manfred, Isabella runs away, and that's how she gets to the church. So when Manfred is then back looking for her, two of his staff come up and say, actually, there is a giant foot and a boot in the castle grounds, that they believe belongs to the giant helmet. And clearly it is the spirit of Alfonso who pops up from the background. This is like a panto. Alfonso was the original head of Otranto, and he died previously, how it got into Manfred's hands, and they believe it's cursed, and Alfonso's after them, and you start realizing that Manfred isn't exactly what he says he is, and oh god, there's so many threads in this. So by which time Matilda, the daughter, has gone off to her room, and she has this amazing session with her maid of honor or chambermaid or whatever, who is called Bianca. And it is literally like something out of EastEnders, because Bianca wants to chat boys, and this is all being written by a bloke in the 1760s, don't forget. And Bianca wants to chat boys and talk about the princes, because it turns out Matilda's in love with a portrait of a mysterious prince that's something to do with Alfonso. Then they hear somebody's voice downstairs, and Matilda doesn't think she should talk to strangers, but she does for a little bit. And then she decides even though this stranger has clearly got the answers, this stranger knows what's going down. But no, that's not Matilda's way. She's a princess and she mustn't talk to strange people, even though Bianca is trying to egg her on, obviously, and get on with all the gossip about the princes. And at one point, Bianca even starts gossiping about how Isabella kind of likes to talk about boys, and she may not be quite as prim as people think she is. And it gets very modern for something that's, get nigh on 300 years old now. So we may have to skip a bit because it gets very convoluted in the middle. But Isabella Isabella's father turns up because he has had a vision that tells him that she is in danger, and he's been shown a saying, which I've got written down, but I've forgotten, but it basically is the curse of Otranto, you know, the curse that's on Otranto, and that a strange prince, the blood of a strange prince must save the princess, and all this sort of thing. Many fights ensue, and we discover that, oh, that's it. I forgot the peasant, you know, because there's always a peasant. The peasant who was the mystery man turns out to be the grandson of Adolfo, right? Grandson of Adolfo. I may be jumping here, but this is how complicated Otranto is. And he realizes it's Frederick, and then he, because he attacks Frederick, injures him. Then they realize it's Isabella's father, but then they realize, oh, thankfully he's not desperately, you know, mortally wounded. This really is a soap opera. And then, now hang on, where have we got to? So we've got to Frederick, we've got to so Frederick, so Manfred turns up and is desperate and gets Frederick to agree that they will marry each other's daughters. So Manfred can marry Isabella, Frederick can marry Matilda. Tell me if I've got this wrong so far, because this is starting to run away with me now. And Frederick says yes. Then he says no. This is where your credits would roll for a bit there into another episode, because Frederick turns around and says, no, actually, no, I won't do it. And so Matilda has run off to see the peasant, who turns out to be Theodore, who is the grandson of Adolfo, because he is the person in the picture that Matilda is in love with. Manfred bursts in, assumes it's Isabella being unfaithful, bearing in mind that Isabella doesn't want anything to do with Manfred anyway, and goes to stab her, because that's a reasonable response when the woman you've raped runs away and takes solace elsewhere. Only it turns out to be his own daughter. So his son's dead, he's killed his daughter, he's trying to divorce his wife, he wants to rape his daughter-in-law. This is going great for Manfred. And so, yeah, horror and woe again. And basically, now somebody's gonna have to remind me here. The denouement is sort of where Manfred realizes that this is not going to work. He is going to have to hand over Otranto, because the true heir to Otranto is Theodore the peasant.
Yes.
Right. So he agrees to go into religious sort of exile with Hippolyta, who's still going with her husband. Hippolyta needs some lessons against the patriarchy, for Christ's sake, because she's been everything so far. She just wants to stand by her man, a man done her wrong, and she's still standing by him. So Manfred and Hippolyta go off into religious exile. The best bit for me is almost the very end, and I've kept the very last page, because so in the end you think this is going to be the romantic ending. So Theodore and Isabella marry each other to save everything, and he inherits Otranto and whatever. But he's in love with Matilda, who's dead because her dad killed her, don't forget. So they marry each other because he was persuaded he could know no happiness but in the society of one with whom he could forever indulge the melancholy that had taken possession of his soul. So they get married because they're equally miserable and they can live together because they each know the same level of misery. So basically it is a rollicking and very confusing tale of betrayal and evil and patriarchy, but in a very old sense of the absolute patriarch. And it gets a bit spooky, but the spook is kind of just used as tropes and sort of ways to make the story move. But it's all done in this spectacular castle, which apparently was based on Strawberry Hill House, because he based it on a nightmare he'd had while staying at Strawberry Hill. So the house actually came first, then Otranto came afterwards, and he filled it with his imagination.
I'm going to give you a round of applause for that one. That was absolutely superb.
It was terrible, Colin. It was so confusing.
It was not terrible. No, it was not terrible, because I tell you what, when you're actually trying to unpick a prototype Gothic novel that is not just a first, like you say, let's go through it. It's not just a first Gothic novel. It's also a first found footage and a first soap opera. When you're trying to unpick all that, and it was written in the style of something that was 300 years old. So you're looking at someone who's copying the style of something that's now 600 years old. It was rather difficult read in that respect. So to unpick it like that is not, it shouldn't not be. What do you think, Ash? I think she needs all the credit in the world for that.
I think, Violet, your summary there was way better than the book.
Did you not like Otranto, Ash?
I was looking at some criticism after I'd read it, and one critic said a lot of modern readers think this is unreadable, and I thought that's unfair. It's fucking unreadable.
It's difficult, isn't it?
It's
I think
very difficult.
It's difficult.
Yes.
That was the most challenging read I've had all year. So, yeah, thank you for that. And normally with these, I'll sort of like go through them 4 or 5 times in the week before we get a chance to sit down and talk to them. And it took me every effort over the fortnight to get through it once. And I was just there thinking, oh, shit, must I? And
yeah, but this is where, you know, as you two both know, this is why we're a week late, because I couldn't get through it enough, and I already know the book, you know, and I already know the book, and I couldn't get through it again enough to remember enough to talk about it in the time that I had left to do it. And it is a really complicated book, and I do feel Walpole just threw everything at it. You know, and it's kind of to be admired for that, but not if you want to read his books.
Well, I mean, I think you've really got to place things in time as well, haven't you? I mean, yes, there's a lot I didn't like about the language that was being used, because it was very challenging. It was very difficult to figure out what was going on at times, and I thought that Tolkien was bad for not being able to understand what was going on at times, but it was some of the battle, like you say, when much violence ensues, you're kind of going, hang on, I didn't realize it's in the middle of a battle.
Yeah, and it jumps from one thing to the next thing without you even realizing they've jumped, and then you're trying to figure out who's related to who and who's trying to chase who. And I actually ended up with spider notes on my paper earlier today, just trying to remember who was related to who. Yeah, and even that doesn't stop it being the same as who's married to who.
And because you got it took me a little bit. I had to wind it back because I listened to it. I have dyslexia, and I started reading it. There's no way I was getting through those words.
No,
so I started listening to it, and I had to wind it back because of Theodore being the heir, and why the priest, who was his father, and how that actually worked. Because he kind of explained that the priest was the father, but then the priest was made a priest because of something else. And there was this whole kind of thing with the Crusades that went on.
And that's been brought in, hasn't it? Because he wants it to look like it's a true story from the Crusades.
Yes.
And I really struggled with that. And when I first read it, that bit about Jerome the priest and how that he's descended from Afonso and all this sort of thing, isn't he? And it turns out that Alfonso had got shipwrecked in Sicily and had met up with some local virgin called Victoria, and she'd had a baby, but he'd already done a bunk by that point, so she'd had a baby. And then I lost it there as well. We all know Jerome ends up being a priest, but we don't know how, really.
Yeah, the whole link, the jump to the priest bit was a bit strange. But like you say, I think describing it as a soap opera, is that because you got Vicky, Bianca, Isabella.
Exactly. And it's interesting, though, the way they're talking, because at this point in time, there wouldn't have been the sort of social constructs that we've got now. Whereas, you know, it's a wholly made up situation. You know, it's unlikely that people would have spoken in that way. So it's weird. They'd have been in similar situations in social structures, but not obviously in crumbling castles with ghosts chasing them. But
you say that, but I mean, it's Russell Brand, I think it was, who pointed out that guys from Essex speak in Old English without even knowing it. Because they sit there and they start going, unbeknownst to me, you know, it's...
I think Essex is supposedly one of the oldest dialects in Britain, isn't it? I think.
I'm a Sussex boy, so I know Sussex as well, the Sussex-Essex thing. But it wasn't as it is now, you know, with that kind of thing. Back then, it was more like a West Country lint to the accent. So, you know, and that was all across the entire South. But it's quite interesting how parts of the country have held on to those kind of ways of talking and some of those older words more than other parts of the country, or different older words. So it kind of still feels ye oldie, so like weldy. But I mean, going all the way back 600 years is a bit, I think you suppose you have to be a bit of an expert to figure that bit out, of whether or not it's actually accurate to Crusade language.
And this is the thing, though, isn't it? And this is kind of what I'm thinking, is that he's made it all up entirely. He has made it up, because he knew even in 1760 odd, he knew nobody knew what they would have sounded like in the Crusades, you know. So he knew that. So he could make up whatever. What's interesting is how like modern storylines it actually is.
Yeah.
Because the madness of somebody then turning out to be the daughter of somebody else. I was just expecting somebody to get out the shower and say it had all been a dream. Do you know what I mean?
It turned the page, and the next page just goes dum, 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 dum.
You actually feel like there should be credits at different points in it. So it is interesting that for something that was written to be old and is 250, 300 years old in itself, it's interesting how modern it is in its take on things. But also without the restraints of modern feeling about these subjects. You know, it would be difficult to get something like that through with all that perceived potential rape and assault and intermarriage and incestuous behaviour. Because an editor somewhere is going to say, for Christ's sake, no, you know, we don't need this, you know, check that out. So he's put all that in. And I have theories as to why you did it, but you tell me why you think it's like.
Okay. Well, I'm going to throw this open to you for a little bit, because I know you were particularly not fond of the book, but I'm going to force you to pull out some interesting parts. What did you find interesting about the book? Apart from the
Well, first of all, I want to go back to Violet, the quote that you'd read from, where it was forever indulge their melancholy. I think that's almost as though he's giving birth to the notion of the goth there, because I think, that's what being a goth is, having sort of like indulging melancholy full on. So I think we're absolutely right. Oh, you're right, mate?
Yeah, no, so dog opened the door and I was just going to shut the door again. It's all right.
I think it's definitely the birth of the goth thing. The fact that it's sort of like a Blair Witch book, that it's found footage, I kind of like that, because it breaks the fourth wall, doesn't it? And it's sort of like, oh, I'm not just sort of like reading a spooky story, but I'm immersed in this world of a spooky story that's been brought out from there. But yeah, I mean, you guys have been saying soap opera, but I've put down the word melodrama here on my notes, because it seemed more melodrama than soap opera. And I know that those two are interchangeable, but yeah, I read it and I felt stupider after I'd read it, just because I was there thinking, people can read, you know, everywhere people were saying, oh, you can get through this in a day, it's just sort of, it's 100 pages, it's nothing. And I'm there thinking, but I don't know who did what to who, with what for how much. It was just, I was just so lost throughout it.
I think you can get through it in that time, can't you? Anyone can read it, and that's why it's used in a lot of places, because it's so short. But whether anyone understands it...
Yeah.
So do you think maybe other people are not understanding it and they're just saying, oh, I've read it and talking about it, but they don't really understand it?
No, people wouldn't lie to me like that. You know, this is why we voted for Brexit and why we've got Tories, because we know people aren't going to lie to us. It's only honest people that are out there.
I think you got a point. It's funny enough, when we were talking before we went recording, I used the phrase lazy reviewers, and I think the literary world is full of people that do that. I think they get a gist of what's going on. They don't try and really look into the creative ideas, what the guy was doing. You know, I mean, it is more than just a straightforward creative vomit onto a page. We've read those, you know. I mean, I think sort of like Dracula's Guest is a little bit like that, where it's just almost like, and you were saying before, The Fall of the House of Usher is like that. It's almost like a stream of consciousness writing, where this is obviously not a stream of consciousness writing. He had very, very definite ideas that he was linking together on them, but they are so complicated. It's almost like the vocabulary hadn't developed enough to be able for him to describe his ideas.
Yeah.
You know, we have much better ways of dealing with that in a language kind of sense now. That back then he was trying to find the words that would twist it around. Because Shakespeare, I know there's links between him and Shakespeare. I think he got a lot from using Shakespeare as a focal point for language.
There's an argument that Otranto follows some of the tropes of Hamlet. And that he's following some of the Hamlet themes, and I think he's probably taken a fair bit from that, because I would imagine he was probably in awe of Shakespeare. I mean, in that's what Walpole perhaps thought was a proper writer.
Yes.
You know, so I think perhaps some of it falters because he's trying to be a writer.
Yeah.
Also, and this is my theory, and you can shoot me down now, but I'm sticking with this one. As you know, I'm very interested in the history of sexuality and stuff. Walpole, I suspect, was gay. He certainly loved his mum more than anyone else in the world and never married, which, you know, back then was sort of a fairly dead giveaway, although obviously he was described as a natural celibate, I think. And I wondered in the depths of it this week when I was trying to reread it and make it make sense, because I kind of love it for its atmosphere, but I hate it for the same reason as Ash does. Do you know what I mean? I think it's overwrought. I think it's complicated. I think it's just ridiculous in some places. And it trips up, with its own wordiness a lot of the time. And I wonder if at the time, because he didn't need to write books, you know, he was the fourth Lord or Baron Orford, you know, he was a member of Parliament, he was a Whig, and he had the money, he had the place, he didn't need to write books. And I wonder if it was a way of him sort of taking it out, literally in his imagination, of these sort of wonderful romantic stories of strong men coming down, because it's all very, you know, archetypal, patriarchal type shit, with your hero and it's like an ingredient for a romantic blockbuster that doesn't quite work. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
So I just wonder if he was trying to sort of displace his own feelings into the book somewhere.
I think you've got a good point there, actually. I think there's a lot of oppressed sexuality that goes on, particularly of writings of that time. And we've been reading an awful lot of these old short stories recently. You know, sort of like getting through one a week. Was it the Man with the Nose we read last week, wasn't it?
Yes.
And they
brilliant title, yeah. Yeah, that narrows it down so much. Oh, it's about the man with the nose. Well,
the man with the nose, not the man with a nose. Don't get the two confused.
It's the nose. Is it the definitive nose?
It's the definitive nose. Yeah. It was great and it was rubbish. And there's a lot of it seems to work with that. And I think it's because you're still talking. It's very early. Proto novels going on as well, aren't you? Like you say, it's the big backlash when people found out it wasn't real, because that suddenly turned it into a European flowery affair, which wasn't what the English would consider a novel, because a novel was, you know, like Moll Flanders, which I just, you know, I read it. But you know, at least this one had chapters.
Well, this is a really good point as well, actually, because novels and stuff like this the system didn't exist as we know it today. The idea of genres, the idea, you know, we haven't even really, you've got into sort of romanticism and whatever, but that's sort of after it. And it's who wrote, my mind's gone completely blank, who wrote Ivanhoe? The famous Scottish
I only know one famous Scot, and that's Robert Burns.
We're all sitting here looking blank now. Yeah, but we all know who I'm talking about.
If only we had a device that we could type in.
Yeah.
But we all know what I'm talking about.
Yes.
So that, even that, which is the sort of start of a genre in itself, you've got your romanticism stuff, comes after, because I think he was born in about the 1760s or whatever. So
Walter Scott,
of course it is. I wanted to say Walter Raleigh. So you've got Sir Walter Scott, but even he hasn't appeared at this point. You know, we've not got into the printing press is only really becoming a thing. You know, we're only just into the first century of sort of newspapers, and novels and the thing. The industry isn't an industry yet. You know, the genres haven't been defined. You haven't got a lot of people doing it because most people can't afford to do it, and if they could, They can't get it printed anyway. It just doesn't exist. So he doesn't have any templates, does he? I mean, we can all write now. You could say, oh, I want you to write a flash fiction of X amount of words, and this is the topic, go. We could all make a go of that and do something. It might be shit, but we could do it because we would know what was expected. Whereas Walpole's writing that blank into the ether, I mean, doesn't excuse it. It doesn't excuse it, but I love it. I mean, I think it's appalling. I'm with Ash in that. I think it's terrible in a lot of ways. It's absolutely terrible. I can't help but love it at the same time, just because of its madness, I think. Yeah.
And it's important. I mean, I will stand on the. I think we can all agree that it is not a greatly written book. It's as far as the skill of writing as a craft goes, it really isn't. As far as a leap of imagination, on the other hand, I think it is marvelous. I think if you take it apart as a piece of creativity, it is right up there, because, like you say, this is coming from an uninformed point. Not like say you can let's say did we mention that we spoke to Ramsey Campbell?
Yes, I've watched some of that. Yeah,
and he's like he would say, he writes that kind of I've lost the thing of it, cosmic horror.
Yeah.
Off the back of what H.P. Lovecraft was doing. H.P. Lovecraft came off H.G. Wells, and H.G. Wells came off the likes of Jules Verne. And, so there was all this kind of, like you say, you've got this setup, and then off the back of that, you've also got Stephen King, and, we've got these great writers. But when you are actually coming from that point of view, if you wrote a novel now that was so different to anything else that was around the place, the only way you would get it out there would be to self-publish it. And then you would really struggle to get a readership, because of most people, you'd have to try and just find the crusties and weirdos that would want to read it.
Well, because everyone's expecting to know what they're letting themselves in for, aren't they? Whereas back then, nobody did, because nobody knew what a novel was, really.
Yeah. They were novels.
And like you said, like now, everybody is standing on the shoulders of previous giants, aren't they? You're all to everybody, at whatever level you're writing at, you're taking, whether it's fiction, non-fiction, whatever, you're writing off the back of other people's work, always. Yeah. Because you're referencing it, if you've read anything in your life, it affects you, and you are referencing it, whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
So he is doing that without anything. And I admire the fact that he clearly doesn't give a shit. I mean, he throws everything in there, doesn't he? Everything. There's mad staff, there's Bianca the barmaid, or whatever she is,
moving paintings,
there's paintings that climb off the walls, there's ghosts,
and I think that was another thing that sort of like boiled my pish, is the way that a Scottish friend of mine will put it. And again, I'm not criticizing. Violet, I get exactly.
I love that you hate it, Ash. I want to hear your hatred for it.
Right. The bit that really wound me up were the massive fucking helmet, the boot, the sword. These were like something that you would expect to find in a Scooby-Doo episode. And there was no pulling the mask off at the end and saying, and it was this janitor, or it was that. They just weren't explained whatsoever.
Does anyone does anyone remember what happened to the boot and the foot? Because I can't remember what happened with the boot and the foot.
No.
I remember the giant helmet was kind of explained as probably coming from the boot and the foot.
The giant helmet came off the smaller statue that would have had a smaller helmet, but somehow it had got giant before it hit the ground. And
that fucking clears it up, doesn't it?
But Walpole actually says, and that makes no sense, basically. And then what I loved about it was that periodically he'll have one of the characters say they could not understand this development. Yeah. And that's it.
But he did. It's like you said, if you're going through a particular, you know what? I just tried to rape this woman, and now she's talking to someone else. She's being unfaithful. I know I'll stab her, right? Like he's from some like East London estate or something, right? And
is there anybody that we don't try and offend in these podcasts?
But what got me was he sat there and go, "Oh no, my son has been killed by this giant helmet, and we've just found this scallywag in the cellar. Stick him under the helmet."
Yeah.
He must have killed my son. Stick him under the helmet.
Yeah, it even says he might not have done, and we've got no proof, but I'm going to assume he did, so put him under the helmet.
Yeah. What the fuck? Game of Mousetrap. Do you think that's where Agatha Christie got them?
But in fairness, also, this is one of the things that does work for it. Whenever I'm teaching murder mysteries in genre fiction, one of the things that I get students to do is go through a murder mystery. We'll sort of like play one of these murder mystery games. And we do it mainly so that students coming away from it with this sense of confusion, because that's what you're supposed to have with a mystery. You're supposed to be completely puzzled by it. And if you're just there thinking, well, bloke with a hat, killed a bloke without a hat, and that was the end of the story. You already know it, and there's no confusion. If you're there thinking, well, what was the timeline and how did they get to there? And so you do get that sense of confusion, but it was just because it was unresolved confusion that it fucked over my OCD.
So do you think he was like, when he was writing it, he was like, okay, I'll throw a giant helmet at him. That's weird. And then just, that's weird. That was a little bit like the man with the nose, I thought. In that,
you know what? I honestly think he probably had a statue in his house that had a helmet on it. I think it was probably that simple. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't think this is the trouble with us looking back at old literature. And this is why I always used to fall out with people in my English literature classes and why I never did finish my A level. Because we try to put a modern analysis on old stuff.
Yeah.
And as you know, as everyone knows these days, a lot of times Charles Dickens was writing piecemeal comics, you know, Shakespeare was writing for money. I think this may just have been something he just wrote, you know, and now we're trying to put on what did he mean by that? And what did that mean? Fuck all. You know, it's just a ridiculous story. It's like, you know, all this shit about what is the meaning of the colour blue in Shakespeare. Maybe that person liked a blue shirt. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. It doesn't always have to have a meaning. And we have a terrible tendency, and generic we, obviously, as a modern society, to assume that we know better, to assume that we can analyse previous culture by our own standards. And I know that, you know, when I'm talking to people like yourself, that's a bit different because you know the context and the overlays on it and you know to remove those while you're thinking about it. But generally, there is a sort of right, and we are all sort of reading this from a perspective of people who are 21st century. We read and write books and we know what we're doing. We can't see it the way that anyone else would have read it. You know, we can't read it as sort of, I'd say virgin territory, but Manfred would try and rape it. Do you know what I mean? So
you're absolutely right, because I've been saying this to a few people about music for a long time, because I back in the 80s I got really bored of music, so I decided to go to every secondhand record shop, and I went all the way back to the 1930s and I bought music all the way through and I listened to the whole lot of it to come up, so that I had some perspective of what it was doing. And that's what we're kind of doing with this, actually. It's giving me and Ash, I mean, Ash has already got a lot of perspective in this, but it's definitely giving me a lot of perspective in where we are now by looking at what they were doing then. And you do have to place yourself in that time, you know, because there's a lot of stuff we've read where you sit there and go, crikey. I mean, the Pigeons from Hell was one that we read, which was written in 1920. But I swear, if you picked that up, you'd think that was written in just about the late 90s. The way that it was constructed. And it was just, so you see these little gems. But you've got to put yourself back in those times. And I know, like I say, I'm going to go back to talk about Mole Flanders in this, because to me, Mole Flanders was just torture to read. However,
I've never read it because I can't fight through it.
Yeah, it's just so flat in when it's trying to do stuff. However, at the time, people were only just reading printed press. You know, I mean, the Gutenberg, I can't remember when the Gutenberg press was done, but that was the thing that suddenly broke the church, you know, because all of a sudden people could read in their own homes. There's a particular monk from around about 1200, I think it is. It's not even, you know, when you consider it that long ago, who was the first to actually read without moving his lips, you know, and that's recorded as doing that. So you are looking at, like you say, you come to this modern world where we now have the ability to have the written word in seconds with each other via these mobile devices, and we are laying that on top of, you know, people that would queue at the dockside to get the next episode of a Charles Dickens.
Exactly, this is the thing, and it's the audience of the time as well. You know, I mean, Who knows? I mean, Walpole obviously intended it to have an audience, so he wouldn't have got it published. But also, he had the money to get it published, you know, so it wasn't such a big deal for him to be published. He could or he couldn't. It was his decision. And there are, at the time, it sold well, but I would imagine the audience was limited to those who could afford to buy it or could even access it, even if they could afford it. You know, we're talking 1760s here. And society at the time was so different in its outlook. So the patriarchal side of this story that is irking me so much wouldn't be noticed to a reader at the time, barely.
No, it wouldn't.
It would just be an oldie to them, an oldie worldy take on what they knew already, you know. So it's I don't know. I love that Ash hated it. I love that because I just think no, but it's so good. Don't you think, as a writer, I always say I would rather people either loved my books or really didn't like them. Yes. If they're just down the middle and they're like, oh, it was all right.
Yeah.
That's the worst thing in the world, I think. I mean,
I've always said that art is in the reaction. So, you know, love or hate, it's a great reaction, you know.
Yeah. And they're a very close thing together as well. They're both evoking an emotional response. And so to hate it, I mean, we all hated it, Ash. We all hated it. It was my fault. This is on me. I thought, I know, we'll do Otranto. It's a good one in the history of literature. It's fairly short. I forgot what a fucking nightmare it is. You know,
but we love, to be perfectly honest with you, Violet, we love hating it. We love hating stuff as well, because we hated Charles Dickens once.
Right.
Yeah, the Signalman. We went through the Signalman the other week. What a pile of shit that was.
Yeah, I've read it, but not for years.
Yeah, don't. Yeah. It's just, you don't know who the narrator is or what his issues are. Another thing that I've got with this one, this fucking thing that you made me read. Another one.
You see, I'm surprised he hasn't done that, actually.
Yeah.
Tell us why you hate it, Ash.
Hippopotamus as a name for a character, all right. She must have had the shit bullied out of her at school, really. And yeah, the whole notion, and yeah, I know it's all about the patriarchy, and we've been sort of like shown that this guy is, well, it's a ridiculous patriarchy we've got, where it's, right, well, I'm already married, my son's died, what emotion am I going to focus on? Raping Isabella. It's how are we meant to identify with this as the main character? You know, it's just, Do you think though that what Violet was saying before, as an oppressed sexuality, that if he's an uninformed homosexual man, that's what he thinks heterosexual men think like? Did you describe him as a natural celibate? Because I don't think there's anything natural about celibacy.
Yeah, that's what he was described as at the time. Contemporary description of him, have him as a natural celibate.
Because he was never seen with a lady on his arm.
And I suspect that was a euphemism even at the time. You know, he was devoted to his mother, was what was said.
Like Norman Bates.
He had very soft shoes. Yeah.
So
I was actually thinking of Ronnie Corbett, to be perfectly honest with you.
Oh, it's sorry. Yeah. It's sorry. But do you think then, Ash, that Walpole's repressions could have wrought this terrible novel?
Almost certainly, yeah. I think it could be the idea that this is how somebody who's gay is sort of like perceiving what heterosexuality is like. Oh, look, there's a woman for me to conquer and whatever. Yeah,
because he's presumably had no sexual experience whatsoever, so he hasn't got a clue. So he's surmising as to what any of them would be doing in those situations, isn't he?
Yeah.
How does this impact on the goth culture, though? The goth culture, where it's sort of like, I mean, goth culture is really quite sexy, but if we're sort of like saying that goth culture is all based on this bloke who's so ignorant of sexiness, and oh, fuck's sakes.
And we're back. Sorry about that. Slight interruption with the phone calls again. Is that Nigerian prince again, Ash?
No, actually, it was my brothel calling to say that I'm getting a refund. Yeah. So, yeah.
Oh, you're getting your own back. Oh, very good.
Yeah.
Yes, very good. Yeah,
I don't know where I was going with that gag.
We were just discussing whilst you were away. Me and Violet were discussing. Apart from the patriarch, who are obviously bad, we were discussing the idea of not liking stuff and liking stuff and just nodding at each other. And I was saying we read The Open Door, if you remember, and we bloody loved it. But because we're discussing it from creative point of views, I think we actually did an hour absolutely gushing over this.
Is that the
story.
Riddell one? Charlotte Riddell, is that Open Door?
Yes.
Yes.
The only reason I sound knowledgeable about that is because I've watched half of that podcast and I thought, how did I not know about this book? Because I don't know it. Yeah.
It's a short story and it's just wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. So we do gush about the nodding, but we do like that whole kind of, because we are deconstructing from a creative point of view. That's why, when we don't like something, like, I was particularly not fond of The Man with the Nose, for example, but Ash quite liked it. And so we had a really good discussion about it.
But do you not think as well, sometimes it is good to kill your darlings? Now, obviously, it wouldn't surprise anyone to know that my favourite book ever is Dracula. But I hate some of that book. I think some of it is clunky. It needed a good edit. Jonathan bloody Harker needs to be pushed off the train before he even got to the castle. And some of it is so clearly Stoker writing out his own sort of thoughts on things and working out his own head. Same sort of repression thing again. So it's not a bad thing to dislike something because you can analyse why you don't like it, and you don't have to blind. And this is what I try and say to other people: you don't have to blindly like something. Just it's like fandoms for things, isn't it? I can love, my love for Nick Cave's not hardly a secret to anyone. There's some of his stuff I can't bear to listen to because it's so terrible.
There's a line in that Nick Cave song, "Wild Rose," where he says at the end. And she planted a rose between her teeth.
Yeah.
And it's just, for fuck's sakes, did you have to go there with that? The rest of it, and the B-side to that one was fucking awesome. What the hell was it? The Ballad of Betty Coltrane.
Betty Coltrane,
that's from Murder Ballads, wasn't it?
That is a really clever song. That's really clever because it goes through everything. And it's so sharp and witty and funny, and terrible that it's absolutely brilliant. But I know what you mean. And he's just done it because it's like, if you listen to, I get everyone to talk about Nick Cave eventually, but if you listen to what I love, and this is a use of language though, you listen to Lover Man and he's got really funny lines, like he's talking about L is for whatever, O is for, and he goes, and N is for anything, and he uses that, and N is for anything you want or whatever, and he's quite good at doing that, where he's taking the piss out of himself a little bit. But some of it's shite. Some of it is shite because nobody, Stoker, Cave, whatever, you can't write anything or do anything consistently and it'd just be wonderful. If it was, that would be tedious, surely.
Absolutely. We just need to tell all the Harry Potter fans and all the Twilight fans that.
Do you know what? I have a thing with Twilight. Everyone thinks I hate it. I don't hate it. I absolutely fucking love Twilight. It's brilliant, sparkly fun. I've got all the books, all the DVDs, everything. However, it is an appalling mess of misogynistic religious bullcrap. Can we just establish that? It's awful.
Yes.
But it's funny and good despite itself because it's escapism. I like it despite its issues, not because of them. I wish it was not allowed to be shown to any teenage girls because it's really fucking unhealthy.
Yeah.
But it's appalling, but it doesn't stop it being good in some ways.
I thought for me, the best thing about Twilight, I read the first two books. And then the best thing about Twilight was the soundtrack to the second film.
Oh, the soundtracks are banging for the absolute series. They're spot on, those soundtracks.
But the actual thing itself, I didn't really get on with, but not to the point where I absolutely hated it. I only hated it from comic performances. It's a great one that you can do a very good comic hatred to.
And the interesting thing is that a lot of people feel the same. I tell everyone about this at the minute. I belong to a Facebook group called Twilight Shitposting. And if you're feeling really brave, there's Twilight Sewer Posting, which is the offshoot of that one, where there's just barely any moderation and everything's in there. But it is wonderful in the fact that it's full of people that love it but shred it at the same time. They know people are very intelligent. People are intelligent. They know what's wrong with it. So they will take the piss. They know which are terrible characters, whatever. Doesn't stop them loving it. And I like that level of self-awareness. And I really think Horace Walpole could have done with some self-awareness, because he never got told no by anyone, did he? Nanny did not tell Horace not to do things.
There is an interesting thing that you just said there, because when you were doing the synopsis, we came out of that. My first thought was, not only did he do the first found footage, and he's done the first Gothic novel and the first soap opera, and as you were saying there, he also, he wasn't the first one to write a shit book, but he was certainly getting there for a shit book that was very well loved. Yeah. There were certain parts of it that do remind me of how Dan Brown writes.
Right. Now,
Dan Brown is very, very well loved. And I think, and I've read a couple of Dan Browns, and I think the guy writes a cliffhanger better than anyone else does. He ends chapters so brilliantly. But I think he just has a weak editor, because most of the stuff that's wrong with Dan Brown, an editor should be sorting out for him. And that's where things like the famous person walked into the, you don't call people the famous person and all this kind of stuff. And there's one, what was it in? I think it was Da Vinci Code, where he described this chief of police coming in and describes her as a woman, and then describes her as a woman again, and how everyone's really surprised because it's a woman, and then actually finishes it as being a woman, as being the punchline to it. And he does it 4 times, and it's just stuff that an editor would have sorted.
Yeah, and I wonder if some people, and probably then as well as now, I'm sure it's been going on since the literary industry sort of existed. Some people get famous enough that people don't want to mess with them. So they perhaps don't get edited when they should be edited, because everyone's a bit too scared to change their words or whatever.
Are we allowed to mention Morrissey's erotic book at that point?
Oh, my God, yes.
has an absolute shitstorm for that kind of thing.
Do you know what? I mean, I've read some, as an erotica writer, I've read some absolute shite, some of which I've written myself, but Christ on a bike.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a man that doesn't know how it works, isn't it?
I was so appalled by it that I actually thought if I ever became a billionaire, I would deliberately reprint that book on sandwich ham.
Yeah, that would work. That would work. It's just, I don't know. I read some stuff like this, and you think, and I wonder how these people can look themselves in the mirror, And I mean, I have that problem myself half the time. I write some bullshit, but because I think it's better to admit that you do. Everyone does. If you write a lot of stuff, it doesn't mean it's terrible bullshit. Might be great bullshit,
It's bullshit.
but it's bullshit. We all know how much I shitpost across social media. But I'm self-aware of, I'm aware I'm doing that. And I surround myself with people who will actually kick me up the jacksie if they think I'm going too far with it. Whereas you think some of these people, perhaps your Dan Browns and certainly your Morrises, they are suffering from that. They're up on a bit of a pedestal, although God knows what pedestal you put Morrissey on. And nobody is telling them no. They're like Walpole without his nanny sort of thing. Nobody is stopping them. And that's not a good thing. And like for all me standing up for Twilight, somebody should have pointed out the abusive behaviour in that at some point, rather than just hanging on to this cash cow that, that's starting to move, and they stuck with it. And rather than just saying, oh, well, it's fantasy, and sort of defending it, admitting it's kind of wrong, but defending it, they should have just said, no, this is not right. We can redo it for a movie sort of thing. So there's that in a lot of things. There's an awful lot of famous books. And we take things a lot more seriously these days, don't we? Things like we said before, Shakespeare and Dickens, they didn't expect their stuff to be analysed by A-level students.
No.
They weren't writing it to be pulled apart in creative writing degrees. Yeah. They were just writing stories. And
it's like this one. I mean, this guy did not write this book to be the prototype Gothic novel.
No,
he wrote a book that he just sort of bashed out.
Yeah, he didn't mean to be the first goth. He didn't mean to do that. He was just being himself. He liked his slightly gloomy Gothic house. He liked that architecture, and that set the template. As it is, I don't think that sets a template for goth anyway. I think your first real, what we'd call a goth novel, is Polidori's The Vampire in 1819. Because that is when you start getting into the archetype of your vampires and your undeath as opposed to your average ghost, because ghosts.
That's the one that was written on basically conceived on the same night as Frankenstein. Is that the?
Ish, yeah, same week. They were there for about a week at the Villa Diodati, and it was actually Byron's story originally.
Oh, right.
Byron wrote the beginning of a story which he called a fragment of a novel, is what he called it. And then he left it and he was bored, and Polidori asked if he could use it, and Byron said Polidori was Byron's physician, and Byron said, yeah, have it, because, you know, Byron didn't give a shit, chuck it away. And but Polidori ran with it. So it was Byron's initial idea. Polidori ran with it, and it is Polidori's story. He ran with it. He built it into what it is, you know, and it's still not a very long story anyway. And it's his story that got published. Ironically, the publisher wasn't stupid, and he put Byron's name on the first editions because he knew that that would sell more. But I would argue that and you've got Frankenstein as well.
Yes.
Which you could also argue is one of the first science fiction. There was somebody in 16 something, wasn't there? There was a woman, I think it was, in 16 something or other that wrote, because there was that big palaver recently where I think the New York Times said that H.G. Wells was the first science fiction writer. And was he bollocks? But honestly, I mean, even if you just remember Shelley, you know, just Shelley, but there was somebody before her as well. But so
in the 1600s, she'd got a guy writing about somebody travelling the canals on the moon. It was roughly around the time of Galileo that somebody was sort of like taking his ideas and transporting them to fiction. So yeah, as much as I love what Mary Shelley did with Frankenstein, and we would say, yeah, it's definitely science fiction, it's not the first science fiction. But the whole thing of what the fuck is science fiction anyway? I mean, how do you actually break the genre down? Does it have to have robots? Does it have to have spacemen? Does it have to have time? Where do we put the genre limitation? Sorry, this is my pet bugbear. I love talking about genre.
I'm really up for genre discussion, because I think genres are a weird thing when you start. Because I've just gone back into writing fiction. I've just started writing fiction again, and everyone I haven't spoken to many people about it. But the first thing somebody asks is, "What genre is it?"
Yeah,
I don't fucking know. I haven't finished writing it yet.
Yeah,
you know, but
completely with you. Yeah,
everyone's expecting it to be a genre, aren't they? So what does make science fiction then?
We've had this discussion. Go on.
Yeah. I was just going to say that Todorov sort of like pointed out that genre is the limitation of expectations for readers, and it's the model for writers. So with genre, to that regard, it's what we want it to be. You know, like if we take it back to, is Die Hard a Christmas movie? Do you know what? If you want to sit down at Christmas and watch Die Hard, it's a fucking Christmas movie. If you're sort of like wanting to watch Die Hard and thinking, I want to watch all the action and Alan Rickman and all the other good things that happen, in that case, it's an action Alan Rickman movie. So yeah, genre is what we want it to be and how we pitch it, really.
It's what you're taking out of it, isn't it?
I've been contemplating this a lot recently. For reasons of, I have an exam tomorrow that's going to feature this, and I'm going to do plot.
Blame you.
We kind of look, because I was thinking about the Christmas movie thing, because we had this big discussion about what is a Christmas movie, and then I sat down and watched Single All the Way, and I suddenly realised that what people think of as a Christmas movie is this romance type idea. The actual archetype, if you go for the massive amount, what is the most number of something that makes up a genre? If we're going to go for that idea, the idea that things only become something because there's a consensus that that's what it is, then it's somebody meets somebody, somebody loses somebody, and the first person that was a friend of theirs in the first place is the one that they're going to end up with at the end, because they're the ones that are really there. That is a Christmas movie. There are a billion, must be at least a billion. There are whole channels devoted to that story.
Oh, look at Hallmark. Hallmark just do those movies, don't they?
Yes, they got. And there's just tons and tons and tons of them. And you absolutely, you could feed it into. It's almost like you could write it with an AI algorithm, or a word template. I see you're writing a Christmas movie, that kind of thing. So all the other arguments about what is a Christmas movie, you can actually take Elf, obviously, but you could even say that Elf isn't, because it even though it has a certain amount of that trope, he meets the girl, ends up marrying the girl, it's that side of things. you could actually watch Elf at any time of the year because it's just an entertaining comedy, where the other ones are so dreadful that they only actually become good at Christmas. You know, there's
Surely
almost like
the
a
only,
transform.
apart from anything else, surely the only Christmas movie that matters is the Muppet Christmas Carol.
That is the only one that matters.
That is a hill I will die on. That is the only Christmas movie.
I'm
a Gremlins Christmas movie.
What are you trying to say, Ash? Are you going to tell me that it's terrible now?
No, it's spooky you should say that, because the book that we've decided we're reading for next week is Christmas Carol.
We're reading the Christmas Carol next week, yes.
And I think Muppet Christmas Carol is probably one of the best adaptations of Dickens that has ever been done. It's just, it keeps the entire narrative tone spot on. So, I
think it's one of the best adaptations ever of anything.
Yeah, it's absolutely brilliant. It's just,
There's that, and The Man Who Invented Christmas. I think The Man Who Invented Christmas is a great telling of A Christmas Carol. I don't know if you've seen that one.
No.
It's basically about how Charles Dickens wrote The Christmas Carol.
Oh, right, yeah.
Very fantasy.
Yeah.
He's having hallucinations. It's very obviously, you know, if you think I'm going to learn how Charles Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol, that's not this film. It's obviously fantasy, most of it. But it's so Christmassy and it tells the story so well. It's just brilliant. So it's a really good way of telling it. So but Muppets Christmas Carol that's one of the greatest movies ever made. To be perfectly honest with you.
Yeah.
And I can't argue with that.
I think we should have a Muppets version of the Castle of Otranto.
You know what? That would be amazing. Can we recast Otranto with Muppets? That's what I'm going to do. When we get off this call, I'm going to start recasting Otranto with Muppets. I'm going to expect contributions from you two. I'm going to stick it on Facebook. Yeah,
it's going to be great to actually see, the attempted rape of Miss Piggy there.
Who would play him?
It's not going to be Gonzo, is it? It's going to be some big scary guy.
I think Gonzo has to play. Apart from Gonzo should be in the Muppet version of the Man with the Nose, but I think Gonzo should play the peasant fella who ends up inheriting the whole thing.
Theodore, hasn't he? Gonzo's going to be Theodore, and I suspect that Isabella will be Miss Piggy. So you're right, Isabella's going to run away from the rapist. So, but maybe, what's the name? Matilda is supposed to be all twee and nice. Maybe she's the chicken that Gonzo ends up with. Remember the chicken?
The chicken.
Gonzo's chicken.
Can we have, for Manfred, Fozzie?
Oh, Fozzie's too nice to be Manfred.
Yeah, it's just going against typecast, and he would just look so worried about every decision that he's
Who's going to play the helmet?
Well, that would just be a Muppet helmet, wouldn't it? But that would be the whole thing. But you could actually have every single time they mention helmet, you could actually have Fonzo going waka waka. My son's been killed by a giant helmet. Waka waka.
Oh my god!
All right, that would make this story so much better. Yeah.
Fonzie just turning up in the middle of the scene. You know, I mean, it gets that desperate, doesn't it? That would be a blessing for everybody if the Muppets just started dancing across the middle of the courtyard when the helmet falls down. You know. Nothing could make it harder to read. I mean, I can only apologise. This is one of the most difficult books.
Don't apologise. It's absolutely perfect and we are going to do that vampire book at one point as well. You know, that is definitely on the list of things that we are going to get annoyed about, I'm sure. But don't apologise for it. I, in a funny sort of way, I thoroughly enjoyed not enjoying it. And I thoroughly enjoyed the creative ideas from it because, like I say, I know there's a lot to not like about it, but from a creative point of view, it is an absolute tour de force of imagination, which cannot be denied.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You cannot say that there isn't enough imagination in Otranto. You know, there's too much imagination. He needs to dial back the fucking imagination.
Yes.
You know, because it's not a really pleasant imagination sometimes, is it? It's a little bit rapey.
Yes.
So dial back the rapey imagination. Other than that, I loved it.
So apart from the rape, the misogyny, and the bad writing, it's great.
Yay!
Yeah,
thumbs up.
That's brilliant. Well, that as well. I'm gonna say thank you, Violet, for introducing us
thank you so much,
prototype. Because it was absolutely fantastic. You have been absolutely wonderful. I actually think you should come back when we do Vampire. What do you reckon, Ash?
Yeah, Yeah, I would love that. Yeah, if you're available, Violet. Yeah,
I will make myself available.
We shall do that in the new year at some point, because I think that'd be great.
I will be available.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Okay, so next week we're reading the Christmas Carol, being all Christmassy and stuff.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And if I can be asked editing it in time, it might even be out before Christmas.
Well,
we'll see how it goes. I've got a bit of time on my hands now before Christmas. To be perfectly honest with you.
So yeah, please hit like, subscribe, and all the rest of it. Violet, thank you so much. That was really brilliant.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
All right, everybody. See you next week. Bye.
Bye.